Imagine a world where the streets reek of rot, where bells toll endlessly for the dead, and where the simple sound of coughing could strike terror into every heart. Europe in the 14th century was gripped by a nightmare known as the Black Death, a plague so ruthless it wiped out entire towns and left cities looking like graveyards. People whispered of God's punishment, of curses carried on the wind, of invisible forces killing their families one by one. And in the midst of this chaos, a shadowy figure would appear, clad in black from head to toe, face hidden behind a long beaked mask that resembled a monstrous bird. To see this figure was to know death was near. This was the plague doctor, perhaps the most haunting profession in medieval history. These men were not the noble saviors you might imagine. Many were failed physicians, barbers, or even ordinary people desperate for coin who agreed to walk into hell when no one else would. Cities and towns hired them on contracts, paying high sums of money and promising food and housing in exchange for their service. Some were even granted special privileges, such as tax exemptions or the right to collect valuables from abandoned houses. On paper, it looked like a secure, well-paid job. In reality, it was a death sentence wearing a uniform, but desperation and greed convinced many to take it, knowing full well that the chance of survival was slim. Their appearance alone sent shivers through communities. The costume was designed for protection, but became a symbol of dread. From head to toe, the plague doctor was covered in a long wax robe made of heavy fabric or leather, sealed to resist the poisonous air people believed carried the disease. Gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat completed the outfit, but the most disturbing piece was a mask. It was shaped like the head of a monstrous bird, with round glass eye holes and a long curved beak stuffed with herbs, spices, flowers, or vinegar-soaked cloth. People believed that by breathing in these sweet or pungent scents, the doctor would filter out the deadly vapors of the plague. He carried a wooden cane, not as a mere walking stick, but as a tool to prod the sick, move clothing or bed sheets, and even ward off desperate townsfolk who came too close. To ordinary people, the sight of such a creature moving through the streets was like seeing a grim reaper with a bird's face. Every day began with the ritual of suiting up. Imagine a man rising before dawn, pulling on heavy robes, adjusting gloves, tying straps tightly around wrists and ankles so not a single breath of tainted air could slip inside. He fitted the mask over his face, its beak filled with lavender, cloves, or rosemary, then lowered the hat onto his head. Once dressed, he was no longer just a man. He became something otherworldly, both protector and omen. When he stepped outside, the streets greeted him with silence broken only by the creaking of death carts filled with corpses and the cries of grieving families. Dogs tore at piles of bodies left unburied, while the few still alive clutched charms and prayed he would pass their home by. His work was gruesome and relentless. A knock at the door meant entering a house where disease had already claimed half a family and was working on arrest. He recorded names of the sick and the dead, acting as both physician and bureaucrat, because towns wanted records of how far the disease spread. Then came the treatments. With his cane, he pointed to a patient's swollen lumps, called buboes, before lancing with a blade to release the foul pus. He might apply poultices made of herbs, onions, or even animal parts, hoping to draw out the sickness. Some days he drained blood, believing the body's humors needed balancing, or recommended bizarre concoctions. Vinegar to drink, emeralds ground into powder, mixtures laced with mercury. None of it worked, but people begged for anything that might give them a chance to survive. Even false hope was better than nothing. The stench was overwhelming. Entire houses were filled with rotting bodies because no one dared remove them. Doctors moved from one darkened room to another, stepping over the dead to reach the living. Sometimes they found children left alone, parents already gone. Sometimes they found whole families locked inside by authorities who sealed the doors with boards and nails, condemning the sick to die together. It was a horror no man could become used to, yet plague doctors faced it daily. Some tried to steel themselves with drink before setting out. Others carried charms or whispered prayers behind the mask. They knew the truth. Their chances of escaping infection were almost non-existent, but they clung to their role because society needed them. Ordinary people viewed them with a mix of fear and reverence. On one hand, their presence meant death was close. On the other, They were often the only ones brave enough to enter a plague-stricken house. Priests refused to come, neighbors fled. Even family members abandoned their sick. The plague doctor, though ill-equipped, became the last-in thread of help for those left behind. Children clung to his robes, begging for medicine for their parents. Desperate mothers offered money, bread, anything in exchange for care. He gave them treatments that rarely worked, but his very presence gave them hope in a world that had none. Superstition guided much of what he did. Astrology was consulted before deciding on remedies. The stars were thought to dictate whether healing was possible. Balancing the bodies for humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, was a cornerstone of medieval medicine, and every cut or potion was aimed at restoring this imaginary harmony. Some doctors stuffed their beaks with garlic, others with sponges soaked in wine, believing each scent held power. They burned incense in rooms, waved herbs under patients' noses, or recommended carrying sweet-smelling flowers to ward off the deadly air. People clung to these rituals as shields against the unseen monster. The psychological toll was immense. A man who signed on for money soon realized he was walking through hell each day. He watched thousands die, saw bodies stacked like firewood, heard endless wails of grief, and knew he could do nothing to stop it. Some grew numb, moving like shadows through the streets, no longer seeing people as individuals but as names to be written in records. Others broke down entirely, fleeing their contracts and abandoning towns, disappearing without a trace. A few even turned cruel, exploiting the desperate by charging extra for treatments or looting the homes of the dead. The line between healer and vulture blurred in those years. The most haunting part was the reaction of the people. When villagers saw the doctor's bird-like silhouette in the distance, panic spread like wildfire. Doors slammed, shutters closed, prayers were whispered. To see him approach was to be reminded that death itself was nearby. Mothers wept at the sight. Children hid. Old men crossed themselves and begged the heavens for mercy. The figure that was meant to protect instead became an omen of despair. Yet in their terror, they still opened their doors when he knocked, because no one else would dare enter. The plague doctor lived on the edge of survival. Behind the mask, every breath was heavy with fear. Every touch of his cane against a fevered patient reminded him that the disease could pierce his layers of protection at any moment. He might spend weeks or months avoiding infection, but deep down he knew his fate was likely sealed. And yet, day after day, he dressed in the robe, adjusted the beak, and walked into the streets again, not because he believed he could cure the plague, but because in a world drowning in hopelessness, someone had to face the horror head-on. As weeks stretched into months, the nightmare only grew. Mass graves were dug outside towns, trenches filled with hundreds of bodies covered hastily with dirt. Plague doctors were sometimes tasked with overseeing these burials, their dark figures standing among grave diggers as the stench rose into the sky. The mask shielded their faces, but not their minds. The image of mountains of corpses would haunt them until their final days. And yet, strangely, they endured longer than expected. The mask and robe, though primitive, offered some protection by covering skin and shielding them from direct exposure. Many still perished, but others survived longer than neighbors or priests who had nothing. This faint advantage convinced people that their costumes held magical powers. The bird mask became a symbol not just of death, but of a strange sort of resilience. But as the plague raged on, one question grew louder. Was the plague doctor truly safe, or was his mask nothing more than a false promise? Could any man survive so close to death for long? That question would haunt every step he took, and in the end, the mask could not hide the truth forever. The story of what it cost these men, physically, mentally, and spiritually, was just beginning to unfold. Behind the terrifying mask and the heavy robe, the reality of the plague doctor's life was far darker than the image suggested. The truth was that he was not a miracle worker, not a savior armed with secret knowledge, but a man thrown into the center of disaster with almost no power to change its course. The long beak filled with herbs might have given an illusion of safety, but the Black Death was merciless. Carried by fleas and rats, invisible and unstoppable, it seeped into homes and bodies no matter how carefully a doctor tried to protect himself. Many plague doctors lived only a short while after beginning their service, falling ill despite their costume. The mask became not just a shield but a ticking clock, counting down the time until death claimed its wearer. People's feelings toward these figures were complicated. In some towns, they were welcomed as the only ones brave enough to face the dying, the ones who stepped where priests, neighbors, and even family would not dare. But in others, they were met with suspicion and hatred. Rumors spread that plague doctors were not healers but bringers of the disease, that their canes spread poison, or that the herbs in their beaks carried curses. Some accused them of taking money from the desperate only to watch them die, or of profiting by looting the houses of the sick. Fear twisted perception, and soon the sight of the bird mask inspired both desperate hope and deep mistrust. To see one arrive at your door was to feel the chill of death itself brushing past you. The treatments they offered often sounded more like acts of desperation than medicine. Bloodletting was among the most common, cutting veins or applying leeches to drain what was believed to be bad blood. It left patients weak and often closer to death than before. Another method was lancing the buboes, the swollen lumps on the body that filled with foul pus. Doctors would pierce them with knives or burn them with hot irons, hoping to release the sickness inside. Some smeared mixtures of onions, butter, and garlic on the wounds. Others prescribed drinks laced with crushed emeralds, vinegar, or even mercury, as if these substances could kill the plague within. They burned herbs in rooms, filled homes with smoke, or advised people to bathe in rose water and drink potions of ground-up herbs mixed with wine. Nothing stopped the disease. Families continued to waste away, and yet people clung to these remedies because any action, no matter how useless, felt better than waiting for death to knock on the door. The cane that plague doctors carried was more than a symbol of distance. It was used to lift sheets from infected bodies, to point at buboes without touching them, even to stir cauldrons of boiling herbs that they believed could cleanse the air. Sometimes it became a weapon against the living, driving away panicked townsfolk who rushed too close, begging for help. The cane reminded everyone that even the healer would not dare touch the sick with his own hands. If the doctor kept his distance, what hope did the afflicted have? Behind the grotesque work lay contracts that told another story. Cities and villages desperate for medical aid promised plague doctors generous rewards, salaries that ordinary craftsmen could never dream of, free housing, food, and even immunity from taxes. For poor men, the offer was irresistible. But these contracts were also traps, binding them to stay within infected towns even as the plague raged. Some tried to flee, unable to bear the constant death, but others honored their bargains, grimly aware they were earning money they might never live long enough to spend. It was said that being a plague doctor was one of the highest-paid jobs of its time, but also the shortest-lived. The suit gave an illusion of power, yet in reality it was a frail shield against a disease that no one understood. The mask kept out some foul smells, but it could not block fleas carrying the plague or protect against close contact with patients. Many doctors died despite their precautions, their bodies buried in the same pits as the victims they tried to save. Those who survived longer carried the weight of unbearable memories. Some left behind writings, grim journals filled with descriptions of streets lined with corpses, mothers clutching lifeless children, and silence broken only by the sound of carts carrying away the dead. These accounts became some of the earliest records of the devastation, though they offered little comfort. Over time, the image of the plague doctor shifted from a real profession into a symbol of death itself. The bird mask, with its hollow eyes and curved beak, began to appear in stories and nightmares long after the plague had passed. In festivals and art, the figure was portrayed as a haunting reminder of mortality, a walking omen that could never be separated from its dark history. In some towns, children whispered tales of ghostly plague doctors still roaming at night, knocking on doors where illness lingered. What had once been a man in a suit of wax cloth became a legend of horror, embedded in the collective memory of Europe. And yet, despite their failures, plague doctors left a legacy. Their detailed notes about outbreaks became some of the first attempts to track the spread of disease, primitive but invaluable to later generations. They showed the importance of recording cases, of recognizing patterns, even if they lacked the knowledge to explain them. Their very helplessness forced society to confront the limits of medieval medicine and slowly move toward new ideas of public health. Quarantine, sanitation measures, and eventually hospitals with stricter rules grew in the shadow of the plague. inspired in part by what these men endured. In this way, the figure who could cure no one still pushed the world toward change. But nothing could erase the personal cost. To live as a plague doctor was to live among the dead. Every morning meant dressing for battle against an unseen enemy that could not be defeated. Every night meant returning to lodging with the smell of death, still clinging to the robe, knowing that sleep might bring the first signs of fever. Their lives were marked by isolation. People avoided them, not just because of fear of the plague, but because they seemed like death's messengers. Many died alone, mourned by no one, buried in the same mass graves they had spent their short careers overseeing. Even those who survived were scarred, haunted by memories of endless suffering that no amount of coin could erase. The sight of a plague doctor walking through a deserted street, mask glinting in the sunlight, became one of the most unforgettable images of the Middle Ages. It was a reminder of both humanity's desperation and its determination. These men were not heroes in the usual sense. They failed to save lives, failed to stop the plague, but they stood where few dared to stand. They became both a comfort and a terror, symbols of fragile hope in a time when hope itself was almost extinct. Centuries later, the bird mask still lingers in art, literature, and even modern costume. It is no longer the garb of desperate men, but a symbol of fear that outlived the plague itself. When we see it today, it chills us not because of what it is, but because of what it represents. A time when humanity was powerless against nature, when people walked among the dying wearing the face of a bird to keep the stench of death at bay. The legacy of the plague doctor is not one of triumph, but of endurance, a reminder of what it meant to face humanity's darkest hour with nothing but a mask and a stick. So when you see that eerie beak-shaped mask, remember the man who wore it. He was not the monster children whispered about, not the villain spreading sickness, not the savior who could cure the dying. He was a man trapped in a nightmare, doing the only job left when the world had lost all others. To be a plague doctor was to walk every day into death's shadow, knowing that sooner or later, the shadow would claim you too. That is what it was really like to be a medieval plague doctor, an existence where fear, hope, and death were stitched into every breath behind the mask.